I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the floor, so I would like to invite all the speakers to come up and join me on the podium, and we will engage in a question and answer session. We have quite a few questions that have come through the pigeonhole. So maybe we will start with one of these questions, which has been addressed to the last speaker. And that question is that China real estate has garnered substantial prices over the years, and the government is currently curbing home prices due to high inflation rates. Do you see sustainable supply and demand of eco-cities and homes, which are viewed as a premium above average home prices? Do you see that as a viable alternative in China based on the Tianjin eco-city experience?
Thank you. I think I would answer this question in two parts. Firstly, the premium. I think that if eco considerations are built in from the outset, if we do green master planning, we focus on promoting walkability, we tap passive design features, then it's not obvious that the premium is large. And secondly, as the empirical evidence has shown in the Tianjin Eco-City, we have been able to sell green homes fairly well, despite China's property market cooling measures. So I think residents are receptive, but of course they're not just buying a green home. We have to provide for them an attractive proposition. It's a green home integrated in a nice environment. And I think if we give them such a proposition, Chinese buyers are willing to pay that small premium for green homes.
So basically you're saying that an eco-city adds value, value that surpasses the value of just the price of the housing, and that will be the value proposition.
Yes, I think that the Chinese buyers are willing to pay a little bit more for a nice green environment.
Second question I think I would like to address to Professor Cramer, because she had talked about several initiatives in Holland that involve technology, and you also mentioned the issue of involving citizens early on in looking at technologies. So basically, how do we involve citizens in looking at technology choices, and how do we involve citizens in the evaluation of those technology choices?
Well, I can give a clear example of what I mean. There are people that like to buy a house, but when you want to buy a sustainable house, there are people that are interested. But then you first ask people who is interested to live in a house like that. Then you have, for instance, 500 people that sign up. Then you have a meeting to see which people really want that kind of house. And then the number of people will perhaps decrease, but in the end, you have people that are really motivated. And they like to buy the house and know the advantages, not only the eco side of it, but the whole story. Why do I think this is important? Because this is a new development, and the ones who live in sustainable homes, they are our propagators of the new future. So if they start to complain, which was the case in the past, then you really have a bad case. You don't have people who are really promoting your case. And the more people are promoting, the more it becomes just the way to live.
Thank you. I think now I would like to turn to the audience for questions directly from the floor. I see Emil Wiglund. Could you please come up and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Emil Wegelin. I am the coordinator of the Cities Development Initiative for Asia, an undertaking by the Asian Development Bank and 4 European governments and the city of Shanghai to help cities in Asia, medium-sized cities, to do a better job in infrastructure planning and programming and leading those to finance. My question is basically to all of you. It seems that from the presentations that, with the exception of Dr. Cheong, most of you seem to be looking at new development. But it seems to me we have another agenda. and that is to deal with the existing built environment, because the environment of the future is already there to the tune of 70%, 80%, maybe in Europe 90%. We have an aging population, we're not growing. And in Asia, we deal with another phenomenon. It is called informal settlements. In the cities in which we work, about 20 to 30%, sometimes 80% in most cities in Bangladesh, live in informal settlements. So how do you apply this concept under those conditions, is my question.
Joaquim, do you want to take first crack at it?
Yeah, I can start. Your point, of course, is extremely well taken. There is a big contrast between, say, cities in Europe and, of course, cities in rapidly urbanizing countries. If you take a city like Paris, the scrapping rate of buildings in Paris is probably 1% a year, so it's kind of, and there's not much you can do about sort of renewable, and renovating buildings. Most of it has to be done to sort of retrofitting, but even this retrofitting takes place in a very sort of slow manner. For the cities that are in the rapidly growing countries, of course, I think what is important is the opportunity, is the fact that you have a possibility now to have an influence on the urban form. And if this urban form, as I say, which is rapidly sort of decreasing in terms of density, if this urban form now takes sort of a model which is a low density sprawl model, then we may lock in the form of the cities in a way that is going to have sort of tremendous impact in their energy consumption and in terms of impacts on the environment. Now, one thing I would like to stress is that in terms of infrastructure investments, we have a lot of evidence on, in some sense, the economic return of infrastructure investments. And what is very surprising is that we say infrastructure is very important for development, we can overcome these bottlenecks, but actually when you look at the return of these infrastructure investments, in many instances, this return is very mixed. We don't, we have the impression that we are putting all this money on this infrastructure, road connections, etc., and you are not getting the economic returns. And the main reason for that is because in many cases, these infrastructure investments are not well complemented with other conditions. For example, in terms of regional development, when you are able to complement infrastructure investments with, for example, human capital, investments in human capital, investments, for example, in business conditions, the whole system has a sort of a chance to work. In examples where we put in place this infrastructure without the other conditions in place, often actually even leads to sort of a leaking effects across regions, which generate this kind of mixed impact of infrastructure, which are not really the fault of infrastructure investments. It are the other conditions that are not in place. And then my last point is about the idea of compact cities, which I think is very important both for the developing world, because we have to, in some sense, induce sort of more sustainable urban form, but also for the countries where the population is aging, where in some sense to manage this shrinking of the population and shrinking of cities. The concept of compact cities, I think it's a very powerful tool and instrument to deal with sort of both situations.
Dr. Chen, maybe you could share with us the Singapore experience with, after all, 30 years ago, Singapore was pretty much one big slum.
Actually, my reaction to that question is really this. I actually do not see the term eco-city. I actually find the term eco-cities and eco-towns a little narrow. I would say that the more important thing is to have sustainable development. So particularly in Asia, and Singapore was like this about 50 years ago, we had exactly the informal settlements and the slums. Nobody talked about eco-cities. But people did talk about the basic essentials, which now, of course, it's become very popular to call it sustainable development. But at that time, basically, economic growth means you need jobs. Environment means, okay, basic, good, less pollution, basic sanitation, water, And social meaning, well, people, you got to take care of the families, and how do you muster some social action together. So I think these values and principles continue rather than to say it's an eco-city. So how can you look at informal settlements and make them more eco? I would rather say that these things don't go away. They are the same things they were many years ago and they're the same things today. But some cities are probably a little bit more sophisticated along the journey. But we still need to find housing, we need to find sanitation, we need to find just clean water for people. So when Singapore was 50 years ago, we had a lot of slums in the city. And surprisingly, the first thing the independent government did was to form the Housing and Development Board, the HDB. It was formed even before we formed the Economic Development Board, because it was felt that housing was so important for people to have housing. But this became the key component for moving everything forward, because by building very affordable, very cheap, affordable housing, we could move the people from the slums into housing with running water and electricity. But it also means that you can start to clear up the city of the slums, replan the entire area, reparcel the land, bring in all the infrastructure, and then start development. And when you start development, that generates revenue for the government. And it starts a very good cycle whereby government then has revenue in order to provide more social services for people. And then it generates jobs. So something has to start in that cycle. So I would say my response to that is actually it's more about the very basic needs you need to take care of, particularly in many cities in Asia.
I'd definitely like to support what you just said, because I think it's impossible to envisage a sustainable city or sustainable urban development if 20%, 30%, or even 50% of the population is excluded. It's just, it doesn't make any sense. You cannot have an ecological city when half of your population is lacking basic services. Another question from the floor? Yes. This gentleman on the right here.
Hello, my name is Madhav Joshi. I'm from India, architect, urban planner. My question actually directs back to the moderator's first expression about eco-cities or cities in general. If one accepts the analogy of cities as living organisms with its own capability, with its own metabolism and capability to adopt and evolve, then can that analogy be extended to find a way forward, or would it have limited life?
That's mine. All right, with your permission, I'll try to answer that. I think I'd like to link that to another concept, a concept that, of course, coming straight out of Rio +20, where a lot of the debate was about the green economy. And I think one of the issues that we are becoming more and more aware of is that there is no one-size-fits-all for cities. And the struggle for sustainable urban development, despite all the advances in technology, despite all the new thinking and new concepts and new tools that we have for designing, planning our infrastructure, each city is its own case. Each city has its own culture, has its own context, has its own physical environment, built environment, has its own people. And the real challenge, and I think this is where the eco-city concept is very useful, is to remind us that perhaps the real struggle for sustainable urban development is precisely place-making. It's how do we make the existing city with its own characteristics greener, more sustainable, more socially inclusive. It's not about looking for a model that can be replicated ad infinitum all over the world. So I would say, yes, the lesson that we can learn from the eco-city movement is that the real promise of the green economy is perhaps finding these tailor-made solutions, tailoring the technologies, tailoring the planning, the design, the urban design, using all these tools to the specific context of each and every city. Because there we will have to bridge and marry global expertise, experience, and technology with local know-how and local knowledge and local culture. Otherwise, I don't think it would be socially or culturally meaningful.
I was the only one who didn't use the word eco-cities because I think that sustainable cities is a more proper expression of what we all mean. So I was not completely following the rules.
I agree with you, but as a historical search shows us, the eco-city concept actually was born way before the sustainable development concept was even thought of. Any other questions from the floor? Any reactions? Any further points that anyone would like to make?
Raise one point that is something that we are confronted with in the Netherlands quite a bit. That is, when you set up consortia of companies, then you also need new financial arrangements. And that is quite different from the way we finance projects in the past. I don't know whether that has been the case in Tianjin, where you have just one developer, or where there are a group of companies involved to do the job. And how do you finance in a way that really balances the cost and the benefits proportionally?
I can answer that question. Well, essentially, in the case of Tianjin Eco-City, there's a 50-50 joint venture with the Singapore side contributing the capital and the Chinese side contributing the land. Now, this is the master developer. The contribution by the Singapore side was approximately 2 billion RMB, and the equivalent land was contributed by the Chinese side. Then what happens is the master developer does not necessarily develop every plot. Each of the plots can be sold, or we can form joint ventures with other developers, and then they'll develop property and then sell that property so it finances itself. The government, in turn, gets taxes from the sale of land, from various other sources, and that finances the development of the eco-city.
I just would like to reinforce the point you stated about we say that indeed a one-size-fits-all doesn't work, but in some sense we need to repeatedly, endlessly, because each time we discuss with regions, with cities, with countries, there is always this tendency, tell me what is the best model. No, it doesn't exist. There are some principles, there are some mechanisms which are general, but then if you really need to put in place this sort of complementarities, if you need to put in place these governance systems, you need really to look sort of a bit locally and look at the sort of specific conditions in each city. There are 3 points I would like to have fun to add, which seems to me are important. We all agree that cities are key. But don't forget that cities are integrated in a wider system of regions. And sometimes, for example, managing excessive urban growth actually entails that we need, for example, to develop in a different way rural regions. This is very important. The rural-urban linkages is something which is extremely important from the point of view of governance, for example, in the provision of certain public services. Sometimes, the administrative boundaries don't fit very well with the functional sort of areas of city and the agglomerations. In order to deal with this complexity of the economy and the functional areas that don't fit with administrative boundaries, you have to put in place a better governance system. And sort of, I would like my final message is really about this governance, the importance of governance, both vertically, alignment of objectives across different levels of government, central government, regions, states, municipalities, but also across sort of local governments, because as I said, the economy doesn't take into account always these administrative boundaries, so we have to have, in some sense, coordinating units that fit much better with economic and environmental realities and also social realities.
Thank you very much. I would like to now bring this session to a close. I would just like to thank, once again, all of our speakers for not only very, very interesting, informative presentations, but also for having kept time. Very important. The timing is very good. Thank you. Anyway, wish all of you the best for the continuing of your sojourn here in Singapore, and I would encourage all of you to go see what's happening in Pudong City.